So I'm going to talk about how to use, there's one more seat here, one more there. But I think there's a seat back there too. Okay, so I'm going to talk about how to use sequence statistics, that is, the statistics that describe sequences of symbols, to fight advanced persistent threats. I'm Ted Dunning, currently Vice President of Incubator at Apache Software Foundation. That's a rotating position typically. I've been there for a year, so probably won't be there forever. Also a committer and PMC member on a number of projects. I can't remember all of them, so it's, there's a lot. And there's a lot of new projects happening at Apache. There's just 2 or 3 that have come in the last week. So if you have something going, you might want to bring it and see if it's a good fit. You can reach me via Twitter, via email. You can probably guess my email, ted.dunning@gmail or tdunning@mapr.com or just about any other permutation of those. And there's a tweet hashtag at the bottom. I'm going to talk about what persistent threats are. It's a specific class of security threat. I'm going to talk about what the attackers do, how they do it. We're going to give some examples, real live criminals. Sequence statistics and how we can use those to attack this, some detection techniques, and specifics about how to do it. This falls into the category of all security talks, which start with a little bit of terrifying stories, a little bit of hope, not much, and then more terror, and then some practical suggestions. This is, you could just use this as the standard agenda for any security talk. So the first example that I want to talk about happened about 3 years ago now in the summer. A number of US banks were targeted by a group of apparently nation-state actors. Wasn't clear at the time. It was dubbed Project Abbabe. And it used a technique which is called brobots. These are bots, a botnet, that means taken over machines that are used to attack other machines. But these were special because these were kind of tier 1 websites with very fat pipes that were taken over rather than home machines. And so a very modest number of these machines, each with a 10 gigabit pipe or more, could send massive amounts of traffic against a target. They observed 75 gigabits and more of DOS traffic against the targets. So it was quite an extensive and effective attack on the people who were not prepared, by the way, with big data, which was the way this was diverted. They also used something called a dork attack, where they used Google to search for the default strings, the welcome strings for Joomla. That's a good indication that that site has not been well maintained because you're supposed to replace that page as you install it. So if you can search for all of the people who are too lazy to properly install their Joomla, you can probably get a pretty good collection of people to attack. A friend of mine actually first described that at DEF CON back in 2001, and still it works. It's depressing, but it happens. And that these guys were very aggressive about that. In fact, when the honeypots were finally set up to try to attack and analyze this, they had a 15-year-old girl write innumerable pages about which Hollywood star would beat another Hollywood star in mud wrestling and that sort of thing. And that was unique content, and so that was indexed by Google quite quickly. And then within hours, these people had attacked that site because they were able to detect that it was a vulnerable Joomla site. The other interesting thing about this attack is the command and control network did not depend on the bots reporting back to the command and control network. Instead, what happened is incoming HTTP requests, which looked like ordinary content accesses, were used to control the bots. So the command and control channel was very hard to see against normal traffic. So we've got some fairly subtle situations here, and they were quite effective. Here's the attack sequence. What happened is the source of the attack, the original controllers, would take over a number of machines to serve as command and control. And they rotated the command and control machines so there was no fixed target. They used, as I said, Google to search for vulnerable machines and then attacked vulnerable Joomla sites to build a robot network. They also then randomized the command and control contacts to try to obscure their tracks. And then they would attack the target. They would just direct massive amounts of requests at the target and overwhelm most places. Now, the frustrating thing is the attacks initially occur one place and the effects occur somewhere else. And so you have this problem of jurisdiction and who's responsible for securing things. That's why these attacks are successful. Now, the idea of an advanced persistent attack is it's advanced. Typically, they use what are called zero-day attacks. These are attacks which have not been well publicized. They may never have been seen before. Now, zero-day attacks are rare because once you use them, people report them and fix them. So it takes a lot of effort to find new zero days. And that effort has to be paid for somehow. There's a limit to how much you can get people to do just for fun of going through decompiled source codes and things like that. And so these are often attributed just on the basis of being a zero day to state-level actors. State-level attackers against infrastructure have the resources to go through and generate zero days. Some of the big attacks have had as many as 20 zero days, which each one is equivalent to about $250,000 to $500,000 of time, research, to find that. And then there's also very frustrating confusion here because some of the state-sponsored attackers are actually given the freedom to act kind of like privateers. Not only do they serve national security or national insecurity goals of certain actors, but they're allowed to take whatever they can steal and keep it. So they're given kind of a privateer, modern-day pirate sort of mission. Then they have specific security attacks that they do, but then they also do normal criminal sorts of things. Now, the persistence aspect of these is that the first attack is typically kept very quiet. They get in, and they go silent as much as possible. There are additional activities that they have to take on in order to stay persistent, but it's very muffled. There is no immediate exploit. As much as possible, there's no immediate damage or purpose to this attack that's obvious. In fact, they will often repair other security holes in the attacked system to prevent other bots from coming in and making noise and causing the system to be cleaned. They install some sort of remote access toolkit, and then at some point they're triggered, and either they start exfiltrating data. That happened, for instance, at Target and Sony, where masses of data are brought out, often with high value, or the compromised host is used to attack some other target. So advanced, persistent, and a threat. You can think of this as going in phase. First attack, the Google darknet sort of approach, then penetrate and pivot. You get in somewhere, and then you have to laterally transfer to the systems you really want. Often something like somebody's laptop is easy to get into, but who cares? But the laptop may connect to something you really do care about. So that's the pivot phase. Ultimately comes the exploitation or the exfiltration step. So you can see these things, alliteration, which tells you which phase you're in. If you're a high-level attack, everybody who works for a bank, raise your hand. Yeah. Everybody who works for a telecom infrastructure, raise your hand. So everybody who has a large retailer, everybody who's a vendor for one of those, raise your hand. It's like everybody here is ultimately a potential target for these sorts of attacks. So for instance, the big Target thing several years ago, that came in from the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning contractor for Target. They were the ones who were compromised, and then from there they pivoted into the security system, the actual antivirus system for the point of sale systems, and so the actual viruses were delivered by the antivirus system, which is ironic. You'd think there's some poetry in somebody's soul there. But a lot of us are targets. And even systems like multi-factor authentication can pretty easily be breached. Perhaps any given person might keep enough hygiene that can't be breached, but if you have more than one person at your company, and if you're high value, you almost certainly do, you can get through. Google has had several cases of multi-factor authentication documented as being breached, so they don't even use that anymore. They use higher security systems. You can assume that somebody will screw up in your organization and that they will get through. You obviously need to keep high security to keep the stupid ones out, but if you have a nation state attacker after you, they will get through to the next phase. And penetration and pivoting is often our best chance for attacking or detecting these attacks. 5 years ago, 6 years ago, that was relatively easy because the remote access toolkit would be very noisy and would use strange protocols. Now it's much harder. The command and control might look as simple as once a week it'll do a DNS request. That can be used to control these things, and that can be very hard to detect. Once the exfiltration or exploit starts, you may be just screwed. Your business may be vaporized. That's what nearly happened to Sony. As much damage as possible was done there before these guys were stopped. So, that's a bummer, huh? This is the terror phase of the presentation. We are not entirely screwed, just close. If people like Google, and I've talked to the Google technical lead for security, these people are deadly serious about it. There's no traffic at Google that's unencrypted. All machines are UAF secured, not just passwords, not just two-factor, but cryptographically secured two-factor. You can plug in 0.5% of the workforce is drafted to work as red team at any given time. So just you're working, the guy will come up to you and say, you, come with us, you're now an attacker. Everything you know is used to attack your own systems then. Even with level of security like that, they still feel that they could be compromised. Most of us don't have this luxury, so we have to be very, very cautious. And one of the key things here is that we can use event sequences as very sensitive detectors, very sensitive and yet robust detectors, because many of these event sequences are side effects of technical properties of our systems that we don't even know about. We can derive the properties of these event sequences by empirical examination of large amounts of data, but we cannot, from first principles, say what the properties should be. And if we cannot say it about our own systems, the attackers for sure cannot know what those properties are, and they therefore for sure cannot, in a dry lab sort of situation, replicate what their systems should look like. Their systems will stand out against these backgrounds. The sequences of headers, what header types, how they're spelled, what ordering they are in requests, what IP addresses are used, sources and destinations, and sequences of IP addresses that are touched. Options in protocols like SSL or TLS can be used. The attacker against Sony used apparent SSL sessions to exfiltrate data, but the options that they used were generated randomly and were completely implausible. I mean, they looked like options, they looked like plausible stuff, but they were completely unlike any actual traffic. And so it would have been very easy to detect that if they had just been looking. You can also look at timing and ordering of requests. If you load a web page and there's images on there, an attacker might not want to load the images. In that case, their sequence of loads will be very odd. The main page will load and none of the images, none of the scripts, none of the style sheets will load. If they do try to do that, then they load the page, they find out what images they are, they request those images or the style sheets or the scripts, but if they're obfuscating where they are through a bunch of proxies, their timing will be wrong. You can paint them into corners with these sequence statistics and timing. You don't know which corner it is, but you can pretty much guarantee that they cannot act like a normal user. All of these characteristics form sequences of symbols that if we can understand the statistics of these symbols, we can understand which ones are in, which ones are out in terms of any sort of important class. Now, current security systems, log analytic systems, typically use handcrafted rules. There's a threat mitigation team. They download whatever threat it is. They try to simulate it. They run it. They drop VMs and things like that. And they try to build handcrafted rules that will detect these systems. But that's far, far less effective because it depends on human intellectual capital and depends on knowing that there's an attack happening. Much less effective than using adaptive statistics against large amounts of data. We can do much better than that. And there's one technique here called the log likelihood ratio test, which figures prominently in the ways of analyzing these sequences. Sorry for the jargon, but you can look it up that way. The basic core technique here is as simple as forming a 2-by-2 table of things that may co-occur or occur in sequence with other things. Call the first thing A, call the second thing B. The times that A occurs with or is followed by B is this cell. When A occurs and other things, meaning B does not occur, is that cell, that count. When A doesn't occur but B does, is that cell. When other things occur other than A and are followed by anything but B, is that cell. All we have to do is count. That's the core statistic we have. Now there's lots and lots of these tables to count. Every combination of A and B will have a table. So we have lots and lots of them to add up and lots of them to analyze. But it's as simple as that. That is the core technique that we need for handling these. And there's a thing called the G-test or the log likelihood ratio test. I've got blogs on it. There's stuff in Wikipedia. This is implemented in Elasticsearch, in Solr, in Mahout. There's copies in R, in C, in Java, in Python, in whatever language you want. It's easy to get this. It's easy to analyze these 2-by-2 tables if you but have that data. Here's some examples. We don't know what A and B are here. These are just 4 situations where some A and some B has been counted. In this first upper left one, if we just take the A column there, when A occurs, B seems to occur about 1% of the time, 1.3%, but we don't know it's exactly 1.3, it's about 1%. When A doesn't occur, B occurs about 1% of the time. We have enough data here to say, that's boring. B just doesn't care if A is there or not. It just happens at about the rate. Now, the upper right case is a little bit more interesting, but not much. A and B only ever occur together and never apart. But we've only seen 3 things ever in the universe. And so, you know, if you've only seen 3 events and you've got things that are A or not A and B and not B, I mean, something had to happen. And so it's just quite plausible that A and B would occur together. And once something occurs together, there's not many other instances that it could have occurred. So they couldn't much occur apart. So this is just boring because there's no data. The first one, there's plenty of data, but no good relationship. Here, there's no data, so we don't know what's happened. This might have been the first 3 observations in that upper left thing, or it might have been the beginning of some strong evidence of relationships. So the top 2 are boring for different reasons. Not an interesting co-occurrence. Now this one is a little bit better. Imagine you're walking along, you walk into work, and you see 2 people walk in. You've never seen them before. You've seen, you know, enough to recognize-ish thousands of people in your life. And these people you've never seen, and they walk in at the same time. That's not enough to go, oh my God, you know, these must be connected somehow. But it is enough that you kind of go, oh, kind of keep that in the back of my head. These people might well be connected. Now, they might just be people who walked in at the same time. If they, on the other hand, walk in the door 10 times and always together, and you never see these people apart, you go, there's a connection. Absolutely a connection. So the one on the left, two rarely seen things have occurred once and together. Might happen. But if we're looking at millions and millions of possible pairs, is the right answer. It kind of rises a little bit, but But this one over here, 10 occurrences of rare A co-occurring with 10 occurrences of rare B, that's something. 10 times in a row, a 1 in 10,000 sort of coincidence happened. Hey, something's going on. And the LLR score, the G-test, puts quite plausible numbers on each of these cases. 14, this is the square root of it actually, so this is like standard deviations. 14 standard deviations is a big deal. 5 standard deviations, which that is not quite, would be good enough to declare a new subatomic particle. If we knew which particle we were looking for, if we were just kind of looking at the whole universe, it's not that big a deal. These are just boring. So that one on the lower right is the one we should look for. Now, actually doing the counting can be a little tricky. It's simple, but the data becomes large. And so if we're looking, say, at headers on requests, the pseudocode for doing the counting is a little bit like this. For each document, each request, each bunch of things, we want to see if A follows B for all the possible A's. So for each document, for each word in that document, well, we saw A. And for each word B that's after A, within some plausible window, we saw A followed by B. And we saw B on the right. See, this is an ordered co-occurrence. And we did see something, by the way, so we're going to count that as well. Now, these are not the numbers in that cell we saw before. We wanted K11 and K12 and things like that. But the things we just did count, we counted K star 1. That's the right B. Anything on the left, B on the right. That's that. And that's just these two cells together. And then K1 star is that other one, that's the left relation. 1 appears on the left. And so from these algebraic relationships, we can get everything we want. K11 is the count, K1x is the left, Kx1 is on the right, Kxx is the total, and then we do a little bit of subtraction, and we get all 4 cells that we want, and we just add to some priority queue, keep the biggest ones, that LLL score. This isn't that hard. You kind of have to think a little bit about how you organize this. You have to realize you're going to count left occurrences, not left occurrences in the right context. You have to do the little bit of subtraction. It's pretty straightforward. If you're going to be doing context where you see Joe went to IP address such and so, Mary went to another address, Joe went to another address. We now have to look at the history of Joe and look for co-occurrences of IP addresses in his history. The history of Mary, look for co-occurrences of IP addresses in her history. Then we do it a little differently because we get a context, Joe or Mary, and B, an IP address. And we want to look for what previous, not look forward, but look previous for that. And the counting is a little differently. In particular, there's this. Now, in the previous example, we had a document of some reasonable size. The number of co-occurrences within a document is like the square of that size. And that's bounded because the documents are bounded in size. Here, the history in some context could be unbounded. And the amount of co-occurrence is the square of that. An unbounded square is not a good thing. That's, that's big O notation, except taken a little bit less specifically. And so what we want to do is we want to have these filters. Once we've seen a certain context enough to characterize it, we quit looking at it. Once we've seen a particular event enough in enough contexts, we quit looking at it. This is an approximation, but it makes this computation finite. Seriously. All we have to do is count those 4 numbers, or combinations of them, stick it into the scoring thing, and that tells us what things we need to look for. Here's some summary of that. Counting, often the hardest part computationally, because there's a lot of things to count. LLR, that's the basic filter for what's interesting that we've counted. And then from that, we can go into more fancy ordering models where we actually try to generate plausible header sequences. You could even use recurrent neural nets. Andre Kaparthi's blog has some great examples of that sort of thing, not applied to security, but just in general. And then one last technique that I haven't mentioned, which is plowing the field. The idea here is that the pivot onto some new system, this lateral transfer, is a time when the attacker becomes visible. Once they've pivoted to that system and are gone quiet, it's almost impossible to find the attacker. So if we re-image the targets for pivoting, like every month, every server will get in a rolling way re-imaged. That's easy to do in a modern virtual world on AWS or in a local cloud. If we re-image those servers, we'll reset them to a clean state. And so the attacker has to go after them again and again and again. And that keeps them active. That lets us keep seeing the signal of their attack and their contact to command and control. So plowing is a great way to cause the statistics to occur. These previous things are how you analyze the statistics. So let's go back to the Abbabe attack. Remember, the defense really has to happen here. We can't depend on the rest of the universe caring enough to do things right. Somebody will screw up. So we have to defend down here. Here's how this one of our customers, a bank in the West, a regional bank, actually did completely defend themselves from this. Large banks, Morgan Stanley and others, were taken down. The way that they defended, this is headers from an actual attack packet, and these are headers from an actual real request. Obviously, there's a difference, right? It's not just that the attackers claim to speak French. That's not the difference. The important difference, this is something that either takes a weird person or it takes big statistics to notice that the accept encoding here occurred before the accept language. Now, those entirely a fine thing to do according to the spec. The only thing is, it never happens. In a year and a half of live real traffic that was not being attacked, it had never happened. Ever. There were many orderings, but nobody among real users ever in their browsers set the acceptable encodings before they set the acceptable languages. All of the attacker packets did that. This is an example of how the attackers cannot know what all of the proxies along the way and what realistic browsers actually do. So they encode their attack packets as what looks completely rational, completely legal, but is also completely implausible relative to empirical fact. With this one fact, the F5 perimeter security system could be set to reject all of these packets and accept all of these packets. So the first level of the attack is now defeated, and the perimeter device can start logging all of the IP addresses that these come from. That IP addresses could be transferred upstream to the provider, and so now the link is even free. The upstream IP addresses get black-holed. No customers live on major websites, and so all of the customer traffic came through, and nothing of the attackers came through. You can see how sequences here, sequences of symbols, the order statistics of those are the key here. So the major attack. Now there was more than that. This could only be found at scale, but there was more that could be found. The next step was to build a honeypot. One of these could be built, and the attackers took it over. And then they could look at the command and control traffic, and here's an error the attackers made. They did it for the best reasons. They put their own source addresses as one of the command and control, but they were trying to, mix it up. They didn't want somebody to put one of these in, see the source, and then one of these in and not see the source. They wanted it to look just like anything else. But large numbers of statistics on multiple robot instances, these always occurred, and these did not always occur. Again, sequence co-occurrence statistics knocked these right out. These were the IP addresses of the guys. This is a major spycraft mistake, and they beat them. These guys are now indicted, and they will never come to the US or travel to Europe. Their fingerprints were found, their pictures were found, their diaries, where they were logging the hours that they were spending on this for reimbursement and for credit against mandatory military service, were found. These guys were nailed, and they're not going to be able to do this as well. So statistics are powerful, unless you really don't care if you wind up on an FBI wanted poster. So that's kind of cool. I mean, clearly statistics can make a big difference in these sorts of attacks. Here's another example. And this one starts with a simulated attack, not necessarily a real attack. The problem here is like the retailers who get compromised as credit cards are used, that data is transferred. That data can then be used to attack other systems. The simulation is we have merchant zero. It's kind of like patient zero in epidemiology. And merchant zero is compromised and leaks some account information. Fraud is committed elsewhere with that leaked information after the exploit, or during the exploit, but after the compromise. There's a high level of background fraud, so you can't even know that every time fraud is detected that it goes back to merchant zero. There's also a lot of false positive fraud, or the background, there's a lot of false negative as well. So we have a difficult statistical problem. We want to find merchant zero using these order type statistics. To review, merchant zero transactions are skimmed. The skim data is used to exploit at some other merchant. Again, it's displaced. Here's a picture of that. This is the compromise period. This is during where the skimming is happening. This is the rate of fraud. You can see the fraud's already non-zero. During the exploit period, the rate of fraud goes up, and at the end of the simulation, it goes down again. Fake, fake, fake. No details of fraud, no details of transactions, just whoever went to merchant zero has a higher probability of being detected as fraudulent. This is the basic algorithm. Pick each consumer, walk from merchant to merchant with a highly skewed merchant distribution. During the compromised term, if you go to merchant zero, you get marked. Later, when you're doing transactions, you have some probability of being flagged for fraud that was higher if you're marked and lower if you're not marked. And then we just restate the data. We sort by time after doing one consumer at a time. This is a very easy code to write, parallelize, simple, get lots of data. We can tune the probabilities, tune the rates, tune the skew. We can do whatever we need to make it more or less realistic. And here's the result. These are bins of merchants with more or less merchants in there, but they're binned based on score bands. And there is merchant zero standing way out of the noise. So the method works on fake data. That only impresses people like us. It doesn't impress bankers that much. But it does impress them enough that they tried it when we were working with a particular Eastern bank. And here's their real data. Now they have more merchants. See the merchants go further out here. See this little weird anomaly here? The simulation is real enough that the same anomaly appears in the real data. And look, there's somebody way up there. This is roughly in the scale of standard deviation. So there's somebody 30 to 80 something 50 standard deviations out of the noise. Something's going on there. Let me repeat, those are really, truly bad guys. I say it a little bit louder on the slide that way. And as it turns out, they did some checking. They called the Secret Service who checked, and this was a major skimming operation. It also happened to be next door to the CIO's house, where he liked to have dinner on the way home. It's like, yes, you cannot make this up for sales purposes. This is effective. If you can arrange that the CIO has been the victim of fraud that you just found and he did not, you win. They bought. But aside from that, we also found bad guys, which is kind of cool when we have a statistical technique which doesn't have a lot of legs on it for this kind of detection. This is a big news kind of problem, and walk in, hey guys, look at this. Sequence statistics gives a really high signal to noise, this historical co-occurrence. Fraud, what places have they been? That fraud is fraud, not fraud. Fraud is condition A. Transacted at a particular merchant is condition B. And we just count them up and we can find these guys. So here's a summary. And we've got a few minutes left for questions. The world can be seen as sequences of symbols. We can find patterns in that. Those patterns can nail the opponents. The opponents are the bad guys trying to mess stuff up. Many of these patterns only appear at scale, but when they do, you can nail people. So you remember the Abbabe, you remember the compromise, and you remember the wanted poster from that. And you can do this. None of this, I mean, this is the kind of code, this is the kind of machine learning stuff where you go, why did I get a PhD? Because this is counting and not much more. And you can do it. Do we have any questions? We have a few minutes. Slim.
Still the challenge is to identify what you call event A and event B, right?
You do have to have some plausible knowledge of the situation. Like you have to realize IP address, header. You have to have some domain knowledge to do this. But from there, you need very little. We've done this for many years in recommendation systems, and these things seem very intelligent. They understand relationships, but music, they understand differences, so on. So we just need to start applying them. The computers are now fast enough to these problems of fraud. There's a person in the back.
Are there cases where the pairwise kind of co-occurrence statistics aren't enough and you need to go to higher order statistics like
So the question is whether pairwise is sometimes not enough. Well, pairwise can be kind of daunting to compute in the first place. And so actually computing all the three-way statistics, you can still do the same statistical tests, but a number of things you might have to examine would be prodigious, even at modern, wonderful computer speeds. And if we catch the guys with pairwise, and we could have caught them additionally with a little bit of three-way connections, I'm not sure I care. So the fact that it works well enough, the fact that certainly in the recommendation world, applying a large amount of additional intellectual effort to the problem does not result in large improvements. All I can say to your question is, I don't know, but I don't know because this works well enough. So it's not a satisfactory answer. I am sure that there are higher order things like recurrent neural nets that would find implausible things in very, very important ways that would be more advanced, but I haven't had a chance to see that really play. Yeah?
I think you still need to do outlier detection, right, to discover an incident like the fraud.
So
Your score jumps up, you calculate that basically, and then you need to, or is it more like that you do it historically, not?
So there's kind of two assertions you made. The first one, which is completely unremarkable, is that you have to have some label for what A is. Fraud, not fraud, I think I'm being attacked, now and then. These are all plausible conditions to use. You might say, I think something bad is happening. I don't know what it is. What's different now from 6 months ago? So you might not know exactly what the anomaly is. You might just have a bad feeling. Or you might continually say, what has changed lately? So you do have to have some indication of what it is. And it is good, as you suggest, to do outlier or anomaly detection. It is absolutely good because that gives you a much smaller list of things to look at. But it is not always true that you must pair those, that the anomaly detection has to show you what's wrong. It can just be that condition A is lately the stuff, and condition not A is a long time ago. That may be enough for you to start focusing in on things, even though you don't really have a good anomaly detector. Everything that you want to do that gives you a strong indication is one step more complicated, more complication, and you have to therefore squeeze more information out of the data. If we can avoid having to have that extra information, then we can work with weaker systems. That's, I think, the summary of what I'm saying. So if we can continue, make progress knowing less, then we have to extract less information and we're more likely to get a good signal. That's a philosophical aspect of it. But I still think everything you said is good, just not necessarily necessary. Right in front of you. Yeah.
Sorry, yeah, another one. Is it possible that the smarter fraudsters could apply these same techniques? They could learn the statistics.
There's a really good question. Can the fraudsters adapt? Well, fraudsters do. I mean, this is not just machine learning. This is adversarial machine learning. They are trying to hide. They're trying to beat you if you do detect them. Now, some of the things they could fake, but some of the things they cannot know. They cannot in principle know. So they cannot know what the typical timings inside your data center are because they can't see that data. They have to deduce what it might plausibly be. They might deduce what it might plausibly be from what they captured in somebody else's data center, but your data center will have oddness. They can't know exactly what it's going to be. And so the characteristics that they cannot possibly know, they cannot imitate. And hopefully you can capture idiosyncrasies of your system, like there's an echo. That's not right. Well, it might be that in your place they were always in echo, but in mine there isn't. For me that would be anomalous, for you it would not be. And the attacker may not know which it should be. So that's the key, is to depend on characteristics that are below the level of theoretical expectation. Are you wiggling? This is like an auction. If you wiggle too much, you'll be forced to give us a question. Yeah.
It's a little bit special, but what methods did you try that you thought would work with the
Well, there's a long history of people trying to build good anomaly detections for security penetrations. And it's quite difficult to do in general. This particular class of techniques is one that I've used many times on ugly, nasty, messy data with heavy mechanical interventions in it. And so I have tried a few other techniques. I've tried traditional sorts of models. I've tried various things. And those very often have assumptions in them. And they behave poorly without those assumptions being true. This sort of technique is such a crude hammer. It's like, a hammer and a chisel, and I just don't really care much about the chisel. That it succeeds in many of these cases where strong assumptions are wrong, and so more nuanced, delicate techniques fail. I think, though, without any justification other than suspicion, I think that other more advanced techniques are beginning to be good enough. If you look at some of the recurrent neural net predictions for sequences of letters, the subtleties that they capture now, so they can recreate entire LaTeX mathematical documents that at first glance look kind of right. They can capture the nuances of XML syntax. They can recreate Wikipedia pages that seem almost like the real thing. And so I'm sure that they could capture some of the structure of these symbolic sequences. Don't know if they can capture it at the speeds we need. I don't know if they can be trained on the volumes of data that we need. There may still be a practical limitation, but I'm sure that we're right on the edge of some of these more advanced techniques doing better than these chisel and a hammer techniques. In the meantime, you can implement the chisel and hammer. You do not need the PhD. So both are interesting. One for pragmatic reasons, one for bragging rights and theoretical and unproven reasons. You're wiggling again. Yes?
When you're choosing A and B, I guess I can think of a massive number of things to be comparing. Would you just, what's the approach for choosing, A and B, like
He points out that when we're choosing A and B, he can think of a massive number. I can think of a bigger number, like massive plus 1. But in practice, of course, we don't even either have to posit a massive number. The data will show that there's an even bigger number, massive times 2, or massive squared, or whatever. There is a truly epically massive number of possible combinations there. That is a theoretical problem in that if we build conventional models across these, we have epic squared number of parameters that we're trying to fit. That is one of the powers of this technique, is we're not trying to fit parameters. We're purely looking for indicators that will flag them, and the indicator weights, if there are such, will be derived by much weaker techniques than actually fitting them. Now, the way we find out which ones to do, is we do all of them. Like, yeah. So if we're talking recommendation engines and music, how many pairs of pieces of music do we consider? All of them. If you got 8 million different tracks, then you've got 64 trillion pairs that you have to consider. Most of them are 0. Only the ones that do occur matter. Many of those are going to be filtered away by those, I know enough already about this. And so we'll be practical. It'll only be a few dozen times the number of data that we see in terms of the computation complexity. But notionally, we are considering all of them. It's just most of them don't have data. The man says my time's up, so I'm going to ask one more let one more question be asked. Yeah.
Do you think at the end that this
Sorry, repeat.
do you think that at the end this computational power and the storage we have with Hadoop is helping both the attacker or the defender of the system?
Is the scale that we have with Hadoop to the advantage of the attacker or the defender? Well, the advantage is always to the attacker, so we must always turn the tables. If somebody is attacking us, we must attack their weaknesses. So just like in the Abbabe thing, we in a very global sense, found a weakness in their procedural aspects. Now we are attacking them, and they must do everything correct to not be detected. Now, if we just purely build it on a defensive status, we must do everything correct, and they must only find one flaw. So we have to turn it the other way, so they must do everything correct. Defense is always harder than attack, because attack has to succeed once, defense must succeed universally. So, yeah, the defender is always at a disadvantage. Let's attack. And thank you very much.